Alright guys, so welcome back. We are on to chapter 56, and this is part 3. And unlike last time where we were talking about conserving individual populations, this section is going to focus on our conservation efforts at more of a landscape or regional level. And the big aims here aren't just to take a look at individual species and their populations and how do we ensure their numbers, but regional and landscape conservation is looking at a much bigger picture. All right, and so they're trying more to sustain the biodiversity between different communities within ecosystems and within entire regional or landscape areas. And your structure of a landscape, per se, is very strongly connected to that idea of biodiversity. So one of the major management ideas here for regional landscape conservation is to protect that biodiversity, all right, and to ensure that we understand what has been going on up to that study point, what's going on presently within that landscape, and then what sort of efforts can we put in place to ensure that that biodiversity continues, or to perhaps in some case bring it back. All right, and so a lot of this happens very closely with developers, governments, and all that kind of stuff to ensure that moving forward that they are protecting that landscape and keeping that biodiversity there. So one of the big things that has come out of this conservation effort is to recognize these boundaries or these edges that are really sort of the defining feature of different landscapes. So going from one type of sort of ecosystem to another is kind of what we're talking about here. So we really build up these edges when we as humans come in and fragment out our ecosystems. So putting in developments, putting in business complexes, putting in roads for that matter. And what we find out is that there really are sort of two major groups of species that come out of these fragmented ecosystems. And those are species that require sort of that interior, okay, much more protected, much more normal, natural state to what their ecosystem should look like. And then these species that end up thriving on the edges of these habitats. And while in some cases having those edges can be beneficial, most of the time the edges that are getting created are those that are being done by us, and what we end up seeing is the fragmentation we're doing is decreasing biodiversity as a whole, okay? So what we need to be conscious of is that when we come in and we do some sort of development in an ecosystem, what that impact is going to be on the species that are currently living there. The other problem with fragmentation is that we're cutting off populations from each other. And that's going to kind of tie back into that idea of decreasing genetic diversity because you're not having gene flow going on. So you have more inbreeding, and it sort of ends up in that vortex that we kind of talked about last time. So one of the mechanisms, one of the conservation efforts that's being utilized is stretches of habitat, particularly that we're fragmenting with roads. We're building these things called movement corridors. And a lot of times you end up seeing them as bridges like you see in the picture. And in fact, there's some of these in PA. So if you're ever doing sort of an extensive road trip, kind of take a look. Sometimes you'll come across these. But they are these strips that are connecting different fragmented habitats. And the hope is that although we realize we're not going to get rid of the roads, okay, so here's one of those, we've got to weigh human demands to conservation efforts. The roads aren't going to go away. They're already there. People use them. So we're building these bridges or these movement corridors in some other manner to help connect populations together. All right. And the hope is that although it's not a perfect solution, that the organisms will find these corridors, will cross them, and hopefully help to promote more stable populations. In addition, hopefully the organisms, deer, whatever, are crossing here rather than in the middle of the roads and causing us all sorts of accidents and that sort of thing too. So, sort of weighing our necessity to have the roads, hopefully a little bit more of our safety by giving the organisms a way to get over that's not crossing the road itself, and in fact allowing them to cross. In addition to those movement corridors, other areas that we're focusing on with this sort of conservation effort are these biodiversity hotspots. And what the hope is that if we can identify these hotspots and protect those areas in particular, that we are then hopefully helping as a whole, all right, to slow sort of the biodiversity that we know is happening. Problem is that the identification of these hotspots is not necessarily easy, okay? If we define a hotspot, we're talking about these very small areas that have high numbers of what they call endemic or natural native species. And more often than not, these hotspots also come with a large number of endangered and threatened species, so they can utilize things like the Endangered Species Act to help protect these areas as well. But a lot of these spots are very much biased towards saving the big mammals, the big vertebrates, the plants. And that's not necessarily all that's out there. We know that there's insects and reptiles and amphibians, and those guys more often get affected by what we're doing as humans than even these bigger organisms do. The other problem is with climate change, these hotspots are going to shift. And so how do we predict and be able to conserve those areas when the climate change that's happening is not necessarily incredibly predictable? All right, but it's a step in the right direction. So by identifying these hotspots, one of the things we can look at are creating nature reserves or zone reserves that we'll talk about in a second. And these are sort of these biodiversity islands, if you will, that we're protecting in the middle of areas that are very much impacted by human activity. All right, and they are typically created around biodiversity hotspots. Problem here again is how big should these reserves be? All right, and for us here in the US, we're talking about things like national parks. And for any of you who have ever visited these national parks, a lot of them tend to be what appear to be incredibly large. And yet they still aren't necessarily big enough. So we have this argument between, do we create these really large reserves so that they are extensively big enough for these larger organisms to have these big areas? So something like the bears here in Yellowstone, they really could use this large of an area for long-term survival. But that's not necessarily feasible given the human activity around the park. And so we create these smaller areas to hopefully stop the spread of disease, keep their populations just high enough. All right, but they're still not necessarily as large as certain conservationists would say is really necessary. And again, it's that balancing act yet again. Zoned reserves. This model has been taken up particularly by other countries. And the idea here is that we understand that there's these national parks, so kind of like the national reserve we just looked at, but then they also have these buffer zones. And what they're attempting to do is keep those national park lands undisturbed by creating these buffer zones around them and really trying to involve ecotourism and community efforts. And when I talk about community efforts, I'm talking about humans who are living and working within those buffer zones to give them something that sort of incentivizes their want to keep those actual national parklands protected. And so the hope is to sort of establish these larger conservation areas, which is the green and the yellow there in those pictures, to keep the encroachment of human activity into those actual national parks, where we don't necessarily have that with those nature reserves. All right, it's the reserve itself, and there's really nothing going on outside that, where this has those national park lands, but then there's buffers built around them.